The morning mist clung to Lake Erie like a shroud of war, masking the waters where the nations would soon clash in one of the most decisive naval battles in American history. It was September 10th, 1813, and 28-year-old Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry stood on the deck of his flagship, the USS Lawrence, watching the horizon with the intensity of a man who understood that the fate of a young republic might well depend on the events of this single day. The War of 1812 had not been kind to American forces in the Great Lakes region. British control of the waterways had strangled American supply lines and enabled devastating raids along the frontier. Detroit had fallen, and with it, American hopes of conquering Canada seemed to drift away like smoke on the wind. But Perry had been tasked with something that many deemed impossible: wresting control of Lake Erie from the Royal Navy, the most powerful maritime force on Earth. Perry's fleet was a patchwork creation, hastily assembled in the shipyards of Erie, Pennsylvania, 9 vessels in total, including the powerful brigs the Lawrence and the Niagara that had been constructed specifically for this campaign. The ships bore the scars of rushed construction, their crews a mixture of experienced sailors, volunteers, and even soldiers pressed into naval service. Many had never served aboard a warship before this summer, yet they would be expected to face the disciplined professionals of the British fleet across the lake. Commander Robert Heriot Barclay commanded 6 British vessels, including his flagship HMS Detroit. Barclay was a veteran of Trafalgar, bearing the physical scars of that legendary battle. He had lost in Armand Nelson's great victory over the combined French and Spanish fleets. Unlike Perry's hastily assembled squadron, Barclay's ships carried experienced crews who had learned their trade in the crucible of the Napoleonic Wars. The British commander understood that his was the smaller force, but he also knew that British naval tradition had rarely been defeated when British sailors fought with their backs to the wall. The strategic importance of this impending battle could not be overstated. Control of Lake Erie meant control of the entire Great Lakes region. If the British maintained their dominance, they could continue to supply their Indian allies, threaten American settlements along the frontier, and potentially retain the old Northwest Territory in any eventual peace settlement. For the Americans, victory would open the door to renewed offensive operations against Canada and secure the frontier that had suffered so grievously since the war began. Perry had spent months preparing for this moment. He had overseen the construction of his ships, trained his crews, and studied every intelligence report about British movements on the lake. He knew that Barclay would eventually be forced to fight. The British squadron was desperately short of supplies, and the American blockade had made their position increasingly untenable. The question was not whether they would fight, but when and where the battle would unfold. As the sun climbed higher on that fateful September morning, lookouts aboard the Lawrence spotted sails. On the northern horizon, the British fleet was approaching, their ships arranged in line of battle, ready to decide the mastery of Lake Erie once and for all. Perry raised his famous battle flag, bearing the dying words of Captain James Lawrence from his defeat aboard the USS Chesapeake earlier that year. "Don't give up the ship." The phrase would soon become a rallying cry for American naval forces, but in that moment, it was simply a reminder of what was at stake. The die was cast. To fleets, representing to great powers, were about to engage in combat that would echo through the halls of history. The outcome would determine not just control of a single lake, but the future of American expansion westward and the balance of power in North America itself. At 11:45 in the morning, the British fleet formed into a line of battle, approximately 4 miles northwest of South Bass Island, near Put-in Bay. Commander Barclay aboard HMS Detroit had chosen his position carefully, hoping to use the superior long-range gunnery that had made British ships feared across the world's oceans. His strategy was simple yet sound: engage at maximum range, where his experienced gunners could pound the American vessels before they could close to effective fighting distance. Perry responded by ordering his squadron to advance in line ahead, formation, with the Lawrence leading the American column toward the British line. The wind favored neither side particularly, blowing light from the southwest, but Perry knew he needed to close the distance quickly. to bring his short-range carronades into action. These powerful guns could devastate enemy ships at close quarters, but they were virtually useless at long range where the British hoped to fight. At approximately 12:15 in the afternoon, HMS Detroit opened fire with her long guns at extreme range. The heavy shot whistled across the water, sending up towering spouts where they struck near the approaching American vessels. Perry held his fire, knowing that his guns could not yet reach the British line effectively. For 20 agonizing minutes, the Lawrence and her consorts endured the enemy bombardment as they struggled to close the gap. Between the two fleets, the British gunnery was devastatingly accurate. Shot after shot crashed into the Lawrence's hull and rigging, sending splinters flying across her deck like deadly rain. Perry's flagship began to suffer terrible casualties almost immediately, as the experienced British gunners found their range and maintained a steady, punishing fire. The young Commodore walked his quarterdeck calmly, encouraging his men and directing the ship's approach despite the carnage erupting around him. When the Lawrence finally came within range of the British line at approximately 12:45, Perry gave the order to return fire. The American guns roared their defiance across the water, their shots smashing into HMS Detroit and her consorts. The sound was tremendous, a continuous thunder that rolled across the lake and could be heard for miles in every direction. Smoke began to obscure the water between the two fleets as the gun duel intensified. According to detailed accounts preserved by the Naval History and Heritage Command, the battle's opening phase demonstrated the tactical challenges facing both commanders as they maneuvered for advantage in the confined waters of Lake Erie. The USS Niagara, commanded by Captain Jesse Elliott, had fallen behind during the approach and was not yet fully engaged with the enemy line. This left the Lawrence to bear the brunt of concentrated British fire from multiple ships. Perry's flagship was designed to fight alongside her sister ship, and without the Niagara's support, she found herself overwhelmed by superior numbers. The British had effectively concentrated their fire on a single American vessel while keeping their own fleet intact. Perry realized his predicament, but refused to withdraw. The battle plan called for a close-quarters engagement where American firepower could prove decisive, and retreating now would hand the British an easy victory. Instead, he ordered the Lawrence to continue her advance, closing to within pistol shot of HMS Detroit. At such close range, the carnage on both sides became horrific as round shot and grape shot tore through wooden hulls and human flesh with equal ease. The other American vessels gradually entered the battle as they worked their way up the line. The USS Caledonia, commanded by Daniel Turner, engaged HMS Hunter while the smaller gunboats and schooners spread out. To support the major combatants, the lake echoed with the roar of cannon fire, the screams of wounded men, and the crash of falling masts and rigging. What had begun as a calculated naval engagement was rapidly becoming a desperate melee, where survival depended as much on courage as on tactical skill. By 1:30 in the afternoon, the Lawrence was a floating wreck. Her masts were shot away, her guns dismounted, and her decks slippery with blood. Of her crew of 103 men, 83 had been killed or wounded. Perry himself had been struck by flying splinters, but remained on deck, still, directing what remained of his ship's fire against the enemy. The British appeared to be winning the battle, but appearances can be deceiving in the fog of war. The situation aboard USS Lawrence had become desperate beyond measure. Perry's flagship was barely afloat, her decks littered with the dead and dying, her guns mostly silenced by enemy fire. Blood ran in rivulets across the splintered planking, and the acrid smoke of gunpowder mixed with the sweet, sickening smell of human carnage. Yet Perry himself remained miraculously unharmed. Despite having his uniform torn by splinters and shot, his survival seemed nothing short of miraculous to the few crew members still able to fight. At approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Perry made a decision that would become legendary in American naval history. Seeing that the USS Niagara remained largely undamaged, but still had not fully entered the close-quarters combat that the battle required, he determined to transfer his command to the fresher ship. This was no simple matter. The transfer would have to be made under the direct fire of British guns across several hundred yards of open water. in a small boat that offered no protection whatsoever. Perry quickly gathered his battle flag bearing the motto "Don't give up the ship," and selected for seamen to row him to the Niagara. Among these brave volunteers were his younger brother Alexander. Perry and several sailors who had already distinguished themselves in the fierce fighting. The small boat was lowered over the side of the battered Lawrence while British gunners, recognizing what was happening, concentrated their fire on this tempting target. The transfer itself became the stuff of legend. Perry stood upright in the stern of the small boat, his battle flag streaming in the wind. As British shot churned the water around them, musket balls whistled overhead while cannonballs sent up geysers on either side of their fragile craft. One witness later described it as the most magnificent display of personal courage he had ever witnessed, as the young Commodore exposed himself completely to enemy fire in order to continue the fight from a position where he might still achieve victory. The journey across the water took approximately 15 minutes during which the outcome of the entire battle hung in the balance. If Perry had been killed or wounded during the transfer, American resistance would likely have collapsed entirely. The Lawrence had already struck her colors temporarily, and without their commander's presence on a fresh ship, the remaining American vessels might well have surrendered or fled. Instead, Perry reached the Niagara safely and immediately took command from Captain Elliott. Perry's arrival aboard the Niagara transformed the battle's dynamic completely. The ship was virtually undamaged, her crew fresh and eager for action, and her guns loaded and ready. Perry immediately ordered the ship to break from her position in the American line and sail directly toward the British fleet, seeking to break through their formation and bring his devastating short-range carronades to bear at point-blank range. This bold maneuver would either win the battle decisively or result in the destruction of his new flagship. The British fleet, seeing the Niagara approaching at high speed, attempted to reform their line to meet this new threat. However, their ships had already suffered significant damage from the prolonged engagement, and several were having difficulty maneuvering effectively. HMS Detroit, Barclay's flagship, had been particularly hard hit during her duel with the Lawrence, and her commander had been wounded multiple times during the fighting. The British line began to show signs of disorder just as Perry prepared to deliver his decisive blow. As the Niagara approached the British formation, Perry could see the full scope of the battle's carnage. Ships on both sides showed extensive damage, their hulls splintered and their rigging shot away. The water between the fleets was littered with debris and, heartbreakingly, with the bodies of sailors who had been swept overboard during the fighting. The cost of this battle was already terrible, but Perry knew that only a decisive victory could justify the sacrifice his men had already made. At 2:30 in the afternoon, the Niagara broke through the British line between HMS Detroit and HMS Queen Charlotte. Perry immediately ordered his guns to fire, and the devastating broadside that followed marked the beginning of the end for British resistance on Lake Erie. The fresh American ship, with her undamaged guns and determined crew, had found the perfect position from which to deliver a killing blow to the enemy fleet. The Niagara's breakthrough represented a tactical masterstroke that immediately shifted the battle's momentum. Perry had positioned his fresh flagship in the most advantageous spot possible between the two largest British vessels, where his guns could rake both HMS Detroit and HMS Queen Charlotte simultaneously. The devastating double broadside that followed sent massive splinters flying across both enemy ships, causing horrible casualties among their already depleted crews. Commander Barclay aboard HMS Detroit found himself in an impossible situation. His flagship had already sustained severe damage during the prolonged duel with the Lawrence, and now faced fresh punishment from an undamaged American vessel at point-blank range. Barclay himself had been wounded multiple times during the battle, shot through the thigh and shoulder, and weakened by blood loss. His ship's steering had been damaged, making it difficult to maneuver effectively, and many of his experienced gun crews had been killed or wounded during the earlier fighting. HMS Queen Charlotte, commanded by Captain Robert Finnis, was in equally dire straits. The British ship had also suffered heavily during the extended engagement, and Captain Finnis himself had been mortally wounded early in the battle. Without effective leadership and with their formation broken, the British ships began to fall into disorder. The disciplined line of battle that had served the Royal Navy so well in countless engagements began to crumble under the pressure of Perry's bold assault. Perry pressed his advantage ruthlessly. Once through the British line, he ordered the Niagara to come about and engage each enemy vessel in turn. The American ship's superior maneuverability, combined with her fresh crew and undamaged guns, allowed her to dictate the terms of engagement. The remaining American vessels, inspired by their commander's example, pressed forward to support the Niagara's attack and complete the destruction of the British squadron. The USS Caledonia, USS Ariel, and the smaller American gunboats converged on the British fleet from multiple directions, creating a deadly crossfire that no enemy vessel could escape. The British found themselves surrounded and outgunned, their formation scattered, and their ability to coordinate resistance rapidly deteriorating. What had begun as an organized naval battle was degenerating into a series of individual ship duels, where British experience and training could no longer compensate for American numerical superiority. At approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, HMS Detroit struck her colors in surrender. The British flagship had been reduced to a floating wreck, her commander badly wounded and her crew decimated. The sight of Barclay's surrender sent shockwaves through the remaining British vessels, as sailors who had never seen a Royal Navy squadron defeated began to contemplate their own mortality. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage the ships had sustained. HMS Queen Charlotte followed shortly afterward, her mortally wounded captain having already fallen, and her crew unable to continue effective resistance. The smaller British vessels HMS Hunter, HMS Lady Prevost, HMS Chippewa, and HMS Little Belt found themselves isolated and surrounded. One by one, they lowered their flags as their commanders recognized the futility of continued resistance. The Royal Navy's supremacy on Lake Erie, maintained since the war's beginning, was finally broken. Perry's victory was complete and unprecedented. Never before in naval history had an entire British squadron surrendered to enemy forces. The psychological impact of this triumph would resonate far beyond the immediate tactical situation on Lake Erie. British naval invincibility, a cornerstone of their strategic position worldwide, had been shattered by a young American commodore and his improvised fleet. The human cost of the victory was staggering. American casualties totaled 27 killed and 96 wounded. Out of approximately 500 men engaged, British losses were proportionally even heavier: 41 killed, 94 wounded, and 306 captured, representing nearly their entire squadron's personnel. The Lawrence alone had suffered 83 casualties out of her crew of 103, making her one of the most bloodied ships in American naval history. As the guns fell silent and the smoke began to clear across Lake Erie's waters, Perry sat down to compose his famous dispatch to General William Henry Harrison. "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." These simple words would echo through American history as the announcement of a victory that changed the entire course of the War of 1812 in the Northwestern Theater. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Lake Erie revealed the true magnitude of Perry's achievement. As American sailors boarded the surrendered British vessels, they found ships that had been reduced to floating charnel houses. HMS Detroit's deck was so slippery with blood that men could barely stand, while her mizzen mast had been shot away entirely. The sight of such devastation sobered even the victorious Americans, who had paid their own terrible price for control of the lake. Perry's first priority was caring for the wounded of both sides. The young Commodore personally supervised the treatment of British prisoners, including the badly wounded Commander Barclay. This gesture of humanity toward a defeated enemy would become part of the Perry legend, demonstrating that American naval officers could display the same chivalrous conduct that had long been associated with the Royal Navy's finest traditions. Barclay himself would later praise Perry's treatment of British prisoners, noting that the American Commodore had shown every courtesy to captured enemy personnel. The strategic implications of the victory became apparent within days. British forces at Detroit, now cut off from their supply lines across Lake Erie, found their position untenable. Major General Henry Proctor, commanding British forces in the region, was forced to abandon Fort Malden and retreat eastward along the Thames River. This withdrawal immediately opened the entire Michigan Territory to American reoccupation and threatened British control of Upper Canada itself. General William Henry Harrison, commanding American land forces in the Northwest, wasted no time exploiting Perry's naval victory. Within weeks of the Battle of Lake Erie, Harrison's army was crossing the lake in Perry's captured British ships, preparing for a decisive campaign that would drive British forces completely out of the Old Northwest. The young republic's northwestern frontier, which had seemed lost after the fall of Detroit, was suddenly within reach of complete American control. The psychological impact of the victory extended far beyond the immediate theater of operations. News of Perry's triumph spread rapidly throughout the United States, providing a desperately needed morale boost to a nation that had suffered numerous humiliating defeats during the war's early stages. Church bells rang in cities across the country, and newspapers proclaimed that American naval forces had finally proven themselves equal to the mighty Royal Navy. The victory helped sustain American will to continue fighting at a time when many citizens were growing weary of the war's costs. Internationally, the Battle of Lake Erie sent shockwaves through the halls of power in London. The loss of an entire naval squadron was unprecedented in British experience, and it raised serious questions about the Royal Navy's ability to maintain control of North American waters. British military planners were forced to reassess their strategic assumptions about the war, recognizing that American naval capabilities had grown far more formidable than anyone had anticipated when hostilities began. The victory also had profound implications for Native American tribes who had allied with the British. The defeat meant that British supplies of arms and ammunition to Indian warriors would be severely curtailed, weakening their ability to resist American expansion westward. Tecumseh and his Confederacy, which had achieved remarkable success in alliance with British forces, would soon face the full weight of American military power without adequate British support. The stage was set for the final destruction of organized Indian resistance. East of the Mississippi River, Perry's personal reputation was transformed overnight from that of a promising young officer to a national hero. Congress voted him a gold medal, and he received congratulations from President James Madison himself. The Commodore's famous battle flag, with its motto "Don't give up the ship," became an iconic symbol of American naval determination. His dramatic transfer under fire from the Lawrence to the Niagara entered American folklore as an example of the kind of personal courage that had won independence from Britain and would preserve the young republic's freedom. The captured British vessels were incorporated into Perry's fleet, giving the Americans overwhelming superiority on Lake Erie for the remainder of the war. This naval dominance allowed Harrison to maintain secure supply lines during his subsequent campaign into Canada, ensuring that American forces would never again face the logistical nightmare that had doomed earlier expeditions into British territory. Control of the lake had indeed proven to be the key to controlling the entire Great Lakes region. The destruction of British naval power on Lake Erie created a strategic catastrophe for His Majesty's forces throughout the Great Lakes region. Major General Henry Proctor, commanding British land forces at Fort Malden, received the devastating news of Barclay's defeat with the knowledge that his position had become completely untenable. Cut off from supplies and reinforcements by Perry's victorious fleet, Proctor faced an impossible choice: surrender his forces or attempt a desperate retreat deeper into Canada. Proctor chose retreat, but his decision came too late to execute an orderly withdrawal. The British commander had waited too long, hoping against hope that Barclay might somehow achieve victory on the lake. Now, with Harrison's army preparing to cross Lake Erie in the captured British ships, time had run out. The retreat that began in late September 1813 would become one of the most disastrous British withdrawals of the entire War of 1812. The abandonment of Detroit represented a stunning reversal of fortune for British arms. The city that had fallen so easily to British and Indian forces in August 1812 was now evacuated without a fight. American civilians who had endured more than a year of occupation, watched in amazement as their former captors fled eastward, leaving behind vast quantities of military stores and supplies. The psychological impact on both sides was enormous. British invincibility had been shattered, while American confidence soared to new heights. Tecumseh, the great Shawnee leader, who had allied his Confederacy with British forces, found himself betrayed by what he saw as British cowardice. The Indian leader had argued strenuously against retreat, believing that a determined defense of Fort Malden might still be possible, even without naval support. However, Procter's decision to withdraw left Tecumseh with no choice but to accompany the British retreat or see his warriors face Harrison's advancing army. Without any European allies whatsoever, Harrison's pursuit was swift and relentless. Using Perry's ships to transport his army across Lake Erie, the American general landed near Fort Malden on September 27th, just days after the British evacuation. Finding the fort abandoned and partially destroyed, Harrison immediately began preparations for a deeper penetration into Canada. The American commander understood that this was his opportunity to inflict a decisive defeat on British forces in the region, potentially ending the threat to the northwestern frontier. Permanently, the British retreat along the Thames River became increasingly disorganized. As Harrison's forces closed the distance, Procter's army was burdened by civilians fleeing American occupation, while his Indian allies grew increasingly demoralized by the prospect of fighting. Without British naval support, supplies were scarce, morale was plummeting, and the pursuing Americans seemed to gain ground with each passing day. What had begun as a strategic withdrawal was rapidly becoming a rout. Perry's role in the pursuit was crucial but often overlooked. His fleet not only transported Harrison's army across Lake Erie, but also provided crucial logistical support throughout the campaign. American supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of wilderness, but Perry's control of the lake ensured that Harrison's forces would never lack for ammunition, food, or medical supplies. The victory on Lake Erie had truly opened the door to American success throughout the region. The strategic situation had been completely reversed in less than a month. British forces that had seemed poised to retain control of the Old Northwest were now fleeing for their lives, while American armies advanced confidently into territory that had been considered lost. The psychological transformation was as important as the military reality. Americans now believed they could win the war, while British confidence in their North American strategy lay in ruins. Native American tribes throughout the region watched these developments with growing alarm. The British retreat meant that their primary source of arms and support was disappearing, leaving them to face American expansion with little hope of effective resistance. Many tribal leaders began to reconsider their alliances, recognizing that British defeat might be inevitable. The foundation of Indian resistance east of the Mississippi was crumbling along with British military power. As October began, Harrison's forces continued their relentless pursuit of the retreating British army. The stage was set for a climactic battle that would determine not only the fate of British forces in the region, but also the future of Native American resistance to American expansion. Perry's victory on Lake Erie had made all of this possible, proving that control of the waterways was indeed the key to controlling the entire Great Lakes frontier. The Battle of Thames on October 5, 1813, completed the transformation that had begun with Perry's victory on Lake Erie. Harrison's forces overwhelmed Procter's retreating army and their Indian allies in a battle that lasted barely an hour. Tecumseh fell in the fighting, ending organized Native American resistance in the Old Northwest, while Procter himself barely escaped capture. The complete collapse of British power in the region was the direct result of Perry's naval triumph. Just 3 weeks earlier, the strategic consequences of Lake Erie rippled throughout the remainder of the War of 1812. British forces were compelled to concentrate their remaining strength in the defense of vital centers like Montreal and Quebec, abandoning any hope of retaining territory in what would become the American Midwest. The dream of creating an Indian buffer state between Canada and the United States died with Tecumseh at Thames River, forever altering the balance of power in North America. Perry's victory had demonstrated that American naval forces could meet and defeat the Royal Navy under favorable conditions. This realization influenced British strategic thinking for the remainder of the war, as London was forced to acknowledge that the former colonies had developed genuine maritime capabilities. The myth of British naval invincibility, so crucial to their global strategy, had been punctured by a 28-year-old American Commodore and his improvised fleet of frontier-built warships. The human cost of the victory continued to resonate. Long after the guns fell silent, Perry himself would never fully recover from the psychological toll of commanding men. In such a devastating battle, the young hero of Lake Erie suffered from what would today be recognized as post-traumatic stress, and his health never fully recovered from the campaign's rigors. He died of yellow fever in 1819 while serving in South America. His brilliant career cut short at age 30. For the sailors who survived the battle carried its scars for the rest of their lives. Many of the Lawrence's crew were permanently disabled by their wounds, while others struggled with memories of that terrible day when their ship became a floating slaughterhouse. The pension rolls of the early American Republic were filled with veterans of Lake Erie, men who had paid the ultimate price for their young nation's naval supremacy on the Great Lakes. The battle's influence on American naval tradition proved enduring and profound. "Don't give up the ship" became an unofficial motto of the United States Navy, inspiring generations of sailors to maintain resistance even in the face of overwhelming odds. Perry's dramatic transfer under fire became a standard element of naval education, teaching officers that personal leadership could overcome seemingly impossible tactical situations. Lake Erie itself was transformed by the battle's outcome. What had been a British-controlled waterway became an American lake, opening the Great Lakes to unrestricted American commerce and settlement. The victory secured the water routes that would become crucial to westward expansion, ensuring that the growing American population could access the rich lands beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Cities like Cleveland, Toledo, and Detroit owed their eventual prosperity partly to Perry's triumph in 1813. The international implications extended far beyond North America. European observers noted that the former British colonies had developed military capabilities that demanded respect and careful consideration. The victory contributed to a growing recognition that the United States was emerging as a significant power in its own right, not merely a rebellious collection of provinces that might eventually return to British control. This perception would influence diplomatic relations for decades to come. Modern historians recognize the Battle of Lake Erie as one of the decisive engagements of the War of 1812, ranking with Jackson's victory at New Orleans and the successful defense of Baltimore as turning points that secured American independence. The battle proved that superior seamanship and aggressive tactics could overcome numerical disadvantage, lessons that would serve the American Navy well in future conflicts. Today, visitors to Put-in-Bay can stand where Perry achieved his greatest triumph, looking out over waters that once thundered with the roar of naval combat. The lake appears peaceful now, its surface giving no hint of the violent struggle that once decided the fate of nations. Yet beneath those placid waters lie the remains of ships and sailors who fought for control of an inland sea, their sacrifice ensuring that the Great Lakes would remain forever American. Perry's victory resonates still, a reminder that courage, determination, and tactical brilliance can overcome the longest odds and change the course of history itself.